Hey guys, Stuart, Tomlinson, Warrior Collective. I hope you're well. Back once again with Inside Chat. Today we're carrying on with our series, speaking to some of the UK's leading doctors and professors about particular topics within the world of sports science. Today's guest, I'm very fortunate and excited to have on Dr. Sarah Williams, whose research focuses a lot on coping under pressure and the effects of stress on performance in sport. So let's get started. Hi Sarah, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you very much for having me today.
No, thank you for sparing the time. It's amazing to have you on. I'm really excited to learn more about the research on this topic because I do think, especially for those of us from combat sports, the effects of stress on performance and yeah, the kind of whole thing about pressure. It's a big thing. I mean, obviously, I'm talking from combat sports, but it affects all athletes in every realms. But before we go any further onto that, can I just ask a little bit more about yourself and your role?
Yeah, so I am a sport and performance psychologist at the University of Birmingham. And what I'm really interested in is looking at how might stress or pressure, so like sporting competitions and things, how might that influence our performance? How might that influence how we feel? How might that influence sort of what we're thinking? And how can we develop ways to help people cope with pressure? Not only cope with it, but how can we maybe get people to really feed off that pressure and perform better than they would do maybe in a training situation?
So they're quite specific topics. Do you come from a sporting background? What got you interested in these particular areas of sports science?
Yeah, so I played lots of different sports growing up. I love sport. I love watching sport as well. And I think the way I got into this area of research was very much my own experiences. What I started to notice in all different sports really was that, I often would feel sort of some stress in pressurized situations, or I might get a little bit nervous. But sometimes I would do a lot better and maybe perform better than I thought I was capable of. Whereas other times I might experience similar feelings of nerves or maybe a bit of anxiety, and maybe things wouldn't go quite to plan. And so that just really got me thinking, why is it sometimes I'm able to perform well with these feelings, whereas other situations I might not be able to perform as well? And that's what really got me into this particular area of research, and how can we try and help people feed off the pressure and do really, really well.
Yeah, I mean that's quite an interesting point, really, because when we talk about stress and pressure, we obviously picture in our heads the negative aspects of it, but like you've just mentioned there, sometimes they can help raise our game, and very often, actually, I've said to athletes in the past, if you're not nervous, you're not taking it seriously enough, and that sounds a bit of a maybe a bit of a wrong way to put it, but I guess what I was getting at was the nerves, you can use them in a positive manner. So how do you define stress and pressure when it comes to the field of sport then?
So I think it's quite interesting because I think lots of people tend to understand what we mean by stress or pressure, but there often isn't just one key definition to explain it. And even in research, different sports and performance psychologists might have their own definition of what they mean by sort of sport and pressure. Um, in terms of thinking about sort of pressure and stress and what might be the similarities and differences, I think the way I like to think about it is that sort of pressure often generates feelings of stress. And the way I tend to think about it is that it's the idea that there's some kind of high demands placed upon us, whether that's a sporting competition or whether that's in another aspect of life. Maybe it's a job interview, or for students maybe it's an important exam or something. But there is some kind of situation upon us where there are high demands, or we're being demanded to reach a certain standard or perform at a certain level. And usually that might be in a certain period of time. So the idea is it's asking us to do something there and then, or maybe a particular exam or a particular sporting competition.
So we mentioned before about the how stress and pressure can be positive. With regards to sport, then, how do you does stress and pressure be defined as in pre-event, during the event? When you talk about with regards to sport, do we set, because a lot of it might be called anxiety, then might it, if it's pre-event, it's the build-up. Do you differentiate between that stress and pressure on the build-up or during the event itself?
Yeah, you can absolutely get different types. So one thing that people often experience might be something like what we call sort of competition anxiety, which is very much in the lead up. And what you'll find from certain athletes in all different sports is that beforehand they feel quite nervous and, like I say, quite anxious. They probably get a lot of physiological responses in that anticipation, and that's something that I'm personally really interested in, is the sort of the anticipation before the competition begins. That's often when athletes do report feeling a lot more nervous, and some athletes will even report that once the event starts, that just completely goes out of their head and they completely forget about that, and they're completely in the moment then doing what they need to do to perform in that moment in time. So that's very much this, we tend to call that sort of competition anxiety, and it's the idea that it is an anticipation of the stress or the pressure, whereas other athletes might experience stress during the event of their competition. And again, that might potentially differ depending on the sport, depending on the nature of the sport. So if you've got something quite continuous, then maybe they don't have that time. Whereas if you're, for example, fighting and you've got different rounds, and in between rounds maybe your mind goes back and you then start thinking about that pressure and that stress again. You often see it in other sports, maybe like tennis, in between games, or in between sets when they're sitting. That might be then when they're experiencing that competition anxiety. And so athletes will experience different types. Some might experience it all the way through. Others might experience it mainly just the pre-competition anxiety. But a lot of the principles and a lot of the things that we try and do to help athletes cope can very much be applied to the different types of pressure that they experience.
So when we talk about the effects of pressure, stress, however we want to define it, are they physical? Are they mental? So are they both? What have your research shown are the main effects of this stress and pressure?
Yeah, there's lots of different responses that we do experience when we feel pressure and when we get stressed about certain situations. So if we have that upcoming competition, we have that upcoming match, often we experience physiological responses. And that can be maybe on the morning of the fight. It could be the day before, even if we're just thinking about it, when maybe we feel those slight elevations in our heart rate. We might feel butterflies in the stomach. It might be that we don't feel like eating. Maybe we're feeling quite sweaty, dry throat, that type of thing. So physiologically, our body does respond to stress. It typically does respond to the stress or the upcoming competition. We also experience psychological responses as well. So as well as those physiological sensations, we can sometimes start to feel anxious, or we start to maybe doubt ourselves or feel a little bit nervous or apprehensive. Maybe some people might even start worrying and catastrophizing. This idea of thinking, what happens if I don't perform very well, or I really want to make sure that I perform well tomorrow. What if I don't fight as well as I'm capable of? And also, when we're feeling anxious, we can also experience changes in our attention, so what we're focusing on as well. And that can often happen sort of during an event as well. So sometimes you might get an athlete who's performing, and in that moment in time maybe they just miss an important cue from their opponent, or they don't quite see something that they would normally notice because they're quite anxious. We get what we call this narrowing of our attentional field, when we just sort of start to focus in too much on certain details and we forget to look at the bigger picture of the information we should be taking in. And all these physiological responses, these psychological responses, and our attention can very much influence and affect then how we go about our performance in our sport.
So you've mentioned there about obviously an athlete can, during the match, can feel that stress and pressure, and obviously it will be different for each sport, as you've mentioned. But it's not uncommon. I mean, you hear it all the time with commentators of any sport, or even people watching. Always, they've buckled under the pressure, and that's a very common kind of line that's given out by commentators, and even when people are talking about their particular sport, the favourite sport that they like to watch. From a coach's point of view then, if there was a coach watching this, how can they help their athlete minimise that risk of, buckling under pressure mid-game, mid-sport?
Yeah, it's a really good question, that. And I think one of the best things that coaches can first of all do is, help the athlete appreciate that these responses we experience to competition are completely normal. Anybody that says that they don't experience responses to, either stress or the competition, they're either probably not quite telling the truth, or what's probably more accurate is maybe they don't see the responses they experience as being responses to stress, and maybe they just refer to them as maybe excitement or adrenaline. So I think sometimes, traditionally over the years, we've often thought about the idea that if we're feeling anxious, maybe that's a sign of weakness, rather than the fact that we're just not preparing or we're not training our mind in the best way to be able to cope with the stress or the pressure. So I think first of all, just being very open with the athlete that, we all experience it. And that can make a huge difference. That can take a lot of pressure off the athlete individually. So it might be that they're experiencing some nerves, some anxiety, but they don't want to mention it because they're worried people might look down on them or think they're not capable of it, that they can't hack it, that type of thing. When actually, just acknowledging that, it's a bit like, whenever you're playing a sport, you identify, what might, not necessarily a weakness, but what might be something that you want to improve upon. And maybe managing those nerves or that pre-competition anxiety is something to do. We train physically in a great way. Why are we not training our minds in equally a really good way so that we can, not only not crumble under pressure, but how can we help become, really mentally strong so that we can actually thrive on that pressure as well? So first of all, doing that, and then just really helping the athlete get in the right state of mind. So confidence, for example, is a fantastic thing that really helps us under situations of stress or anxiety. So in competition, if we're a more confident athlete going into that fight, we're less likely to be negatively affected by any of the stress or anxiety that we feel. So as a coach, it's about thinking about ways to boost your athlete's confidence. So is it maybe helping them work on things where by doing that helps them feel better about themselves? Is it maybe reminding them about all the positive things they've achieved? Again, that can improve our confidence as athletes. And then also just being accepting of some of these psychological skills that athletes often use, by encouraging the athlete to try some of these and actually, being accepting of those being used as part of a training program can really help the athlete feel more able to do that. And therefore, by using those psychological skills, they can also then help manage that pressure and really thrive off the feelings of it.
So what kind of psychological skills are you referring to? What can you give any examples of these?
Yeah, so there's lots of different ones, and even just beyond just the psychological skills, even just helping educate athletes about the benefits of the responses we get when we're stressed can go a huge way. So traditionally, I think you mentioned earlier that stress and pressure tend to be viewed quite negatively. But actually, there is quite a bit of research out there, and especially talking to successful athletes and more elite athletes, it's the idea that, some stress, some anxiety can be a really good thing. So the physiology that you experience in anticipation, that increase in heart rate, that's not you experiencing a negative thing. That's your body preparing for competition. It's preparing for that fight by delivering blood to the muscles so that they're ready, they're feeling more powerful, they're ready to contract. It's delivering blood to the brain so that you'll be able to execute your strategies and think quickly on your feet when you're competing. Those nerves and that anticipation, I think you mentioned earlier, if you don't care, it's not, that's actually a bad thing. And again, elite athletes talk about the idea feeling a bit of nerves is good, because it means you care, it means you want to do really well, it means you're that little bit more switched on and alert to things. So just educating people and particularly athletes about that can really help, because when you then as an individual start to experience those feelings and sensations, reminding yourself this is me getting in my zone ready to perform can have a much better, much more positive impact on then how you go out and perform, compared to if you experience those sensations and start worrying and thinking, oh no, I'm not feeling good, I'm not going to perform very well. That's when you can start talking yourself out of the fight before you've even started. Or seeing it as a positive thing can make a massive difference. So that's one key thing. But then also we can use other techniques, maybe like imagery, which is often also known as visualization. So using that to kind of picture or imagine maybe certain scenarios that you want to happen. You might run through certain things in your head about how you might want to fight against your opponent. Are there certain ways that you want to set them up to be able to maybe execute a certain move on them? That type of thing. If you do it in your mind first of all, that can first of all give you more confidence that you're going to be able to do that, because you've almost seen how to do it, how to execute that. But even on the day when you then come to fight, if you've gone through that fight in your mind beforehand, it almost feels like you've already done it once before, and again, it doesn't feel as sort of nerve-wracking or as unfamiliar to you.
So when we talk about, obviously, stress and pressure, although we're talking about sports, are these the same sort of techniques that you'd use across the board? Because obviously, if we look at different areas of life, this stress is a factor in many places, but extreme stress and pressure can be found often in like military, for example. You know, the more frontline the military, the more stress and pressure they're under, and you know, potentially in other areas of life, work, home. Do these techniques work across the board, or do they have to be different depending on that?
No, the great thing about these techniques is that they do work across, so they're very generalizable to different situations. And like we've talked about, stress and often the responses we get when we are stressed or when we are facing a pressurized situation are very, very similar. So, you might have a fight and you might experience similar responses if you have a job interview next week. So it's great that we can be very flexible and we can transfer these skills and use them in different scenarios. And what I would say is that in terms of sort of do we ever need to do things slightly differently, I would say the bigger focus is more sort of what's the activity that we're doing and how stressed is that making us feel. Because if something's making us feel more stressed than something else that might be making us feel stressed but not as stressed, we might then maybe go about things in a slightly different way. And so I think it's really important that as athletes or even as individuals, we try and get an idea of sort of what sort of stress levels tend to be good for us when we perform. When is it good to have that bit of adrenaline, or when is it good to sort of think about things in a slightly more anxious way compared to if we're just completely relaxed and we don't care about it type thing. So identifying as an athlete, what's your optimal zone? Where do you need to be? And that can really vary sometimes on the individual. So certain athletes like to really pump themselves up. That really helps, and in a way you're generating a stress response. You're really getting yourself to think, you're wanting your heart to beat faster, the adrenaline you want to be flowing through your veins so you feel really switched on and ready to go. Whereas for other athletes, they might experience a bit of stress, but maybe too much starts to feel a little bit more overwhelming. So first of all, from an individual level, that can really vary. And then secondly, the task that we're engaging in. So if we're fighting, for example, maybe we do want to really pump ourselves up. Whereas if we've got a job interview, we may well still want to pump ourselves up, but we might not want to go into that room absolutely shaking on the adrenaline that we've got. So it's a balance. It's very much a balance between what works for the individual, and that might be influenced based on what situation you're facing. But deep down, the same principles apply in terms of we experience a stress response, we need to see it positively as a good thing, and there are certain strategies that we can use to then fine tune it in terms of its intensity, or in terms of whether we see it as being helpful or whether we see it as being a negative thing.
Yeah, and you make some interesting points there. And one of the things that I wanted to bring up as well is, and you just mentioned it there, adrenaline. Because often very, novice fighters, or even if you're kind of heightened for whatever reason, you can have that adrenaline rush, adrenal dump pre-fight, or you dump it in the first round. So obviously we want to be able to control this adrenaline release throughout the fight, and use it to throughout our sport, and use it to increase our ability. But if we use it too early, then we're almost fatigued as a result of having used all adrenaline before the fight or before the fight's finished. How does that kind of correspond with your research, that adrenal dump, that control of adrenaline?
It's a really good point. And again, adrenaline is very much a response to feeling stressed. So it's a really nice example to show how actually stress is a good thing, because without that adrenaline, you're probably not going to last very long in a fight, if you don't have that. So I would almost say that from an individual point of view, again, it's about trying to identify what's the right state of mind to get yourself into before you compete. That doesn't mean you're going to dump it out in the first round, for example, or the first couple of minutes of a fight. And so that does come a little bit with sort of practice and experience. And often, the better fighters and the more elite athletes have a better sort of track record in terms of what they've achieved, so they can work that out. So that does come a little bit over time. But then we can also try and use techniques maybe like imagery to help pump us up if we do experience a scenario where maybe we've exerted a little bit too much adrenaline. Essentially what we want the body to is we want the body to stay in that stress response, so that it keeps producing that adrenaline, it keeps producing those hormones that make us more psyched up, more ready to go, so that we can continue performing the best of our abilities.
So if you had to work with an athlete who may be mid-event or even pre-event, was needing to be pumped up or their adrenaline was looking like they were switching off, how would you speak to them? What would you say to them?
I would beforehand. I would probably try to work out, what is it that's motivating them. So when they feel like they've given absolutely everything, what is it that's going to get them to dig a bit deeper? Is it something their opponent said previously? Is it the fact that they're fighting, to show their family how good they are? What is it that's driving them? Why do they want to achieve what they want to achieve? And I would probably try and get them to really focus on that and say something to try and really get them going. So some people play sport or fight when they feel a bit more angry as well. So is there something you can do to try and draw that anger out of them? So it's very much about trying to work out, what is it that gets the best out of that particular fighter? And that's also where the coach can come in. So going back to that question about what can the coach do, they can sort of help with that, and get them to really think about that and focus on those things to get them fighting at the best of their ability.
So I'm guessing then that this can start within training. Can these sort of things be done in training then to help prepare for those possible scenarios in competition?
Absolutely. And one of the key things that we tend to do with athletes to really help them perform under stress and under pressure is to also think about what we call what-if scenarios. So that we know as an athlete, and also even as a coach or a sports psychologist, somebody supporting them there and then, if certain things happen on the day, what are we going to do? How are we going to respond? And sometimes that can just be the athlete knowing, okay, well, if I'm down a certain number of points at this time, what am I going to do? Or if this niggle of an injury starts to hurt a bit more, how am I going to change the way I'm fighting so that doesn't become an issue? So developing what-if strategies can be really, really important. And they can be very much devised in training and also even implemented and tried in training as well. And what we can refer to it as is this idea of simulation training. And what we can do with that is we're almost trying to simulate a competitive environment. So we're trying to make it as close as possible to a competition. So rather than just maybe going through sort of fight moves or a bit of a fight, maybe have something at stake to try and enhance the pressure, or maybe have people watching, because maybe on the day of the competition people are going to be watching. So by trying to simulate as much as possible the demands that are going to be placed on that athlete, they can not only get used to fighting in that pressurized situation, but it's also a nice opportunity to practice some of those what-if scenarios to see whether they work. The nice thing also about on the day is that often, if we've already done a bit of that practice, then when we come to it, because it's not as unfamiliar to us, and often that's when we panic the most, when we feel the most anxious, is when we're uncertain. So uncertainty is a real key thing that influences our anxiety and our stress. If we can kind of minimise that uncertainty and control what we can control, it helps us feel more confident and we're able to perform well in those situations.
So from an individual point of view, what can an individual do? Are there any techniques that an individual can use to help reduce their stress, reduce their anxiety pre-event, during the event?
Yeah, so I would suggest when you experience those stress responses, first of all, remind yourself, this is me preparing, good, things are kicking into gear, things are getting ready, think about the previous times when you have felt those responses and performed well. So think back to those successful fights, those really good wins, and remind yourself that, to do that, I needed to have these types of responses, because that can really help us feel that we're in the right frame of mind. And then, I'm a big believer in the power of imagery, of using our imagination to think about scenarios, simply imagining it going really well, fighting, feeling those adrenaline rushes, executing certain moves, hearing, maybe if we've got crowd watching, hearing people cheering, that type of thing, maybe seeing our coach encouraging us, by picturing all of that and imagining the feelings, sensations of that scenario, it can really help prepare us for what's going to happen. It then almost makes us want to execute that. And also just kind of using imagery to practice what-if scenarios as well. So what if this happens? Okay, well then I'll do this, and go through that in my mind. So identifying, what am I worried about, or what are the things I tend to worry about, and almost going through in my mind how I can prevent those being an issue. And by doing that, I find that can make the individual feel a lot less anxious in a negative way, but you can still experience a stress response, but feed off that, and you can go into a fight feeling much more confident.
So are there any good kind of stress training, simulation training examples that you've seen used in sports around the world to help their athletes during training prepare, to deal with that high level stress, that high
Yeah,
level
there isn't
pressure?
necessarily a specific template because the goal is really just to try and create a scenario similar to what it would be like during competition. So quite often what you'll do is you will just work out, okay, so we've got a fight, let's say on Saturday. Who's going to be there? What's it going to look like? If you're going to be fighting in front of maybe the other competitors in a tournament, how many do we think there's going to be? Maybe about sort of 20 or so. Right, well, see if we can get sort of 20 or so people to watch, to try and mirror that in training as it would be maybe in the competition environment. Potentially, can we train in maybe the same environment that we're going to be fighting in? That can also help as well. Again, it's just things we can do. Or can we set maybe up how we're training to look a little bit more like it? Or maybe even we just get our athlete to look at pictures of what it will look like, and then they can sort of train while thinking about that environment. So it's more a case of just trying to do things that are going to help us create a more competition-like environment for them to practice in. And that's when we can then, that's when we have the similarities between the practice and the competition. And hopefully then when they're in the competition environment, they've almost been through these situations before. So it's almost a case of identifying with the athlete what is it about the day that's different to when we're training, and then trying to identify, okay, well, if it's this and this, let's then try and put some of those things into our training so that we get more used to it. If we can't put it into our training, let's put it into our mind when we're imagining, and let's do some of this training in our mind so that we get used to what it's going to look like, how it's going to feel, so they're not, again, on the day, we've already experienced it once before.
So when we talk about mental imagery, then how do you feel that is best used to help improve sports performance and negate the negative aspects of stress?
Yes, the first thing to think about is what is it. So maybe we're using it to regulate the negative aspects of stress to help it be a positive thing. So let's first of all work out with the athlete, what do we need within us as an individual to see the stress more positively, and then from there we can work out what the imagery is going to target. So is it that we're lacking confidence, for example? Maybe that's the issue. If we feel more confident, maybe we wouldn't be as affected by these responses to stress. So maybe for a particular fighter, it's just they need to feel more confident. And from there, once we've identified confidence as being the key thing we're trying to target, we can then think about what type of imagery is going to help enhance their confidence. So for one person, maybe enhancing their confidence, it might be just simply imagining performing really, really well. Maybe that's going to enhance their confidence because they see themselves in their mind perform those moves, and that in turn can enhance an athlete's confidence. And we know from talking to athletes that by going through fights or certain things in their head, they feel more confident they can do it because they've almost seen themselves do it before in their mind. Or maybe it's thinking about previous fights when they've performed that skill. So they feel more confident going into that fight, and therefore they're not as affected by the stress in a negative way. Whereas for other athletes, maybe it's more to do with, yes, they want to enhance their confidence, but maybe picturing those things isn't going to be as beneficial or is not as helpful. So maybe for them, enhancing confidence, it might be just imagining themselves feeling confident, feeling powerful, feeling those responses to stress in a really positive way. So they can almost picture themselves standing in a ring or wherever they're fighting, with just confidence soaring through their body. They're about to start the fight and they're going to completely take their opponent to pieces. They're just absolutely ready. And by simply imagining that can enhance their confidence. So it's really individual for different athletes. We know from the research that imagery works in all these different ways, but the important thing is that it works in different ways depending on the individual, and it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's more a case of identifying with the athlete, what are we wanting to get out of this imagery, what's the purpose, and then working with the athlete to identify what is it that you can image that's going to target what we're trying to change. And that can be a bit of trial and error as well. So there's not a set way of doing it, but we know that can be a bit of trial and error as well. So there's not a set way of doing it, but we know we can imagine skills. We know we can imagine performing strategies and routines. We can imagine ourselves winning. That's another way to enhance confidence. Just imagine picturing yourself winning, feeling, really positive about yourself, coach cheering you on, that type of thing. We can also imagine other things like the feelings or sensations that we want to be experiencing in a competition, emotions, feeling focused, feeling mentally tough. So we know we can use imagery in all those different ways, and by doing that, it can serve one of the different reasons why we want to get benefits from it.
So if we talk about those coaches who maybe train juniors, does it change with junior athletes? Because obviously with juniors and young children, sometimes they don't have that same self-awareness. So how do you help junior athletes? Because again, some junior athletes are competing at a high level, and their stress and pressure maybe is equal, and you could even argue sometimes more because they don't have that maturity to equal sports, not life, do they? So how does it change with junior athletes? Well, how would you suggest helping young athletes cope with stress and pressure? Is it similar to adults?
I think it's similar principles, but it's obviously, like you said, it's taking into consideration the fact that depending on the age and also the level of maturity of the younger athletes, they might not be as aware of what they're feeling, and they might also not be able to verbalize or explain properly how they feel. So some of them, they may be affected by stress or pressure when they're performing, but they might not be able to explain as well sort of what it is they're experiencing, or if we try to use a certain technique with them, whether or not it's working properly. So it is still about having that open communication, and it can be really powerful with younger athletes, often just really talking to them about stress and really educating them, or teaching and encouraging them to see stress as a positive thing. And that's a nice example of where, as younger athletes or children or adolescents, they tend to be much more receptive because they haven't got as long a track record. Potentially, they tend to be much more receptive at being educated. Just naturally, they tend to listen to their teachers and things. So as a coach, or somebody else that they, parent or somebody, if you're talking to them about the importance of stress, and they're very open-minded. I found before chatting to sort of younger athletes that they tend to be a bit more receptive of the idea that stress can be a positive thing, whereas sometimes slightly older adult fighters or other sports, they're a little bit more, surely it's not a good thing, because they've almost built up a mindset that stress isn't positive. So in some ways it can actually be easier to explain and convince the younger athletes. You don't need to necessarily give them all the evidence to show that it's a good thing. And that can be really helpful for them, because when they suddenly feel, as they might talk about, butterflies in their tummy or whatever they're talking about, it's easier for them to say, oh yeah, I'm getting ready to fight. Again, it depends on the age of the youth athlete. But we can definitely use other strategies as well. Sometimes there might be a bit more trial and error with them, because maybe they can't tell you whether or not something's working straight away. But the good thing is that usually, as long as we're imaging positive scenarios, it's not going to have a negative effect on them. So back to the example earlier about how to enhance confidence, we might image two different things depending on the athlete. If one thing isn't working for a child, if they're imagining themselves performing certain skills correctly, that's not going to have a negative effect on them if it's not enhancing their confidence. It's just more of, maybe we need to try something else next time. So maybe we just imagine themselves winning. That might be something that would be quite easy for them to imagine, but also then experience those positive feelings and confidence as a result of it.
And I guess with junior athletes as well, parents play a big role. So there's a couple of scenarios that I see on a fairly regular basis in these grassroots ones. It's, so if the parent's got a child who has gone to the event, and half an hour before the event is saying they don't want to do it anymore, or they've just started the event and they've got so emotional and worked up that they burst into tears mid-event. How would you deal with these sort of situations? What would your advice be to a parent, and potentially, I guess, a coach? But I guess parents feel obliged to protect their children, and they can't recognise that this stress is not them not wanting to do the sport; it's the physiological impact of the pressure. And so, what would you advise them?
Yeah, I think it's really important to almost try and find out sort of, what is it that's causing the tears? Why do they not want to do it? What is it that is it that it's the pressure that they're experiencing themselves? Is it pressure that's coming from somebody else? Sometimes it can be things like maybe the athlete just feels the pressure of just wanting to please, their mum or their dad. And they've almost put that, maybe the parent has put that pressure on them, but quite often the parent hasn't put that pressure on, but maybe the child has put that pressure on themselves because they've just interpreted it as, I need to win today because, dad really wants me to do well. He's really happy when I win. And so sometimes, younger athletes put pressure on themselves because they misunderstand. So I would say it's really important to chat to your child about the situation. And it might not even be in the competition. Sometimes these conversations are better away from the competition, because during the competition, especially if there's already tears or they're already really upset, it can be really hard to get responses from the individual, depending on the age, obviously, but also those responses are probably going to be very much influenced by the emotions they're experiencing at that time. So it's almost a case of maybe outside of the competitions, if we talk about last week, at the fight, obviously you were really upset. Are you enjoying your fighting at the moment? You said you didn't want to compete on Saturday. Why was that? Just to try and get an idea and really remind them or make it really clear that as a parent, you're not wanting them to win. You're just wanting them to enjoy themselves and try their best. And that can make a huge difference. We know from the motivational literature that it is so much more productive if kids focus on trying their best. Not only do they tend to perform better, but they don't experience as much of that pressure and that anxiety when they're trying to win, because they can't control that. They may come up against a better opponent. Because they can't control it, they feel much more anxious, they feel much more stressed. So just trying to help them focus on things that they can control. So maybe trying to execute a certain move, or maybe trying to do something in that performance. Maybe the goal might be just to try and stay calm and to not get upset during the competition. Giving them goals they can focus on, that they can control, or they're more likely to be able to control, can really just take a lot of that pressure off and make the kids enjoy it much more. But it's very key that it comes from the parents. And a lot of parents may feel, well, I've never put any pressure on my kids. I've never said I want them to win. And they may well not have. But the idea is that as the child, they may have seen it slightly differently. So it's more just making that absolutely clear to the kids that no matter what, they still love them, they still support them, and they just want to see them happy. And that can have a huge benefit on a young athlete.
Yeah, I guess it's difficult, isn't it? Because obviously you want junior athletes to love their sport, but on the same token, you've got to simulate the competitive element in order to prepare them for, these more intense periods of competition, the stress. So it's a very difficult one, isn't it? How do you think that line's best skirted then? If we're talking like with junior athletes, is to push them hard enough to prepare them, but on the same token, like you've just said, it's not necessarily about the win, it's about the enjoyment. That's quite a difficult line to draw, isn't it?
Yeah, and absolutely. And sort of, if you think about elite athletes, often the reason they're in it is to win it. They enjoy it because they win it. And so what I think research tends to find is that as long as sort of both things are being done, as long as you're still focusing on enjoying it, mastering new techniques and things. So, with younger athletes, and that's where, as they get older, the shift can come slightly more in terms of some of maybe those more competitive elements and trying to win. And I think it's more a case of just, it's great to put yourself out there and try these things. And it's more a case of don't fear the failure. If it doesn't quite come off in training, don't worry. If it doesn't quite come off in that match, don't worry. We've got another competition coming up in however many weeks or months' time. So it's being able to bounce back from these setbacks, I think that's really key. And I think by having that pressure initially taken off with the idea, we just want them to be happy and enjoy it, once that's very solid in their mind, we can start building up some of the other aspects of, okay, now let's start trying to compete. Simulation training is great as well, because it just almost gives them a taste of competition at training, so that then when they go into an actual competition, they've again had some of that experience in that training environment. So it's very much it's a balancing act, and as they progress and as they go teenagers and through up through the age groups and things, that's when you can start emphasizing more and developing that more competitive edge of trying to really emphasize the sort of beating the opposition, but you've still got that fallback of, okay, well, it doesn't matter, let's go again next week. Building that confidence is key. I think if we can get people feeling confident and we can get that to be sustained, so even when we're losing or even when we don't perform as well, if we can still feel confident, that's often when the athlete can come through stronger and go again the next time.
So if you were speaking to someone now, we shift our focus back to adults a second, and they've maybe never competed before, so they've got no prior experience, what advice would you give to them on the lead up to their first, let's say first fight, first event? What would you say to them? What should they be focusing on now? On, let's say we're 6 weeks away. What would be your tips for success on their first competitive outing?
Yeah, I think first of all, I would remind them that the responses they're experiencing are there to help them perform better. So they will naturally perform better with some of those responses than they would have done without them. Because I think the thing we need to remember with athletes that are maybe starting out their first fight, they have nothing to go on. So they have no previous fights that they can draw on for any successes to help them feel more confident. So try, because of that, they'll likely experience maybe more stress, more anxiety. So reminding them that that's going to help them perform better. That can sometimes help reduce the symptoms they're experiencing because it almost puts their mind at rest a little bit. They don't panic as much about how they're feeling. And then it's about trying to take the pressure off them. So in a way, if they've never fought before, sometimes people might look at that and say, they've never fought before, this could go horribly wrong. But actually, you can almost flip it on its head and you can say, you've never fought before. So the pressure isn't on you. That we have nothing to expect of you. Anything you achieve is better than absolutely nothing. It's just about getting the experience there. You have nothing to lose going out there for your first fight. And so by almost turning it around in terms of how we might then see the situation, that can often take the pressure off as well. There is nothing to, the pressure is all on the opposition, especially if they've fought before. So it's their fight to lose rather than, your fight to lose, so to speak. Just go out there and do the best you can, get the experience, and we can go from there and we can continue to build and progress. And then I would just say, in the build up to that first fight, it's about coming up with that fight plan of what you're going to try and execute and those strategies. How are you going to try and win this fight? And developing those what if scenarios as well. And, don't overload them because they've not fought before, so they've not got lots of experience. But maybe you've identified a couple of things with them, maybe the fighter and the coach perhaps, of what they might do if this happens or if that happens. And just get them to stick to that. That can really make a difference going into that first fight. If you don't really know what to expect, having that plan in your mind of what you're going to try and execute and having those what if scenarios can help you really focus on that and hopefully then not get as overwhelmed by the sort of the uncertainty of the event.
So, we talk obviously there about first timers, but what are elite athletes and world champions doing that these first timers and hobbyists, novice athletes aren't? So what do you see as the differences?
A lot of it is the type of things we've talked about, really. So, often in their minds, they're not experiencing stress, they're experiencing excitement, or they're experiencing adrenaline, or if they are acknowledging that they're experiencing nerves, they see it as that good thing. So usually, elite athletes in all sports tend to see their responses to stress more positively than sort of non-elite or novice athletes. So we know that across the board in all different sports. Through their experiences, some of it may have been trial and error, some of it may have been working with psychologists or their coaches, but through their experiences, they know the right zone they need to get into, or they have a better idea of how they need to feel, what sort of intensity do they need to feel. And they also have a better record of knowing, how to help with that adrenaline release. In terms of making sure they don't peak too soon and making sure that they start, they come out the blocks, fighting really well in that first round. So they just have a better track record of doing that, so they know sort of what frame of mind to get themselves into or how they need to feel. And then because they know that, they then also have their sort of skills that they will use to get them into that right frame of mind and to make sure that during that match, if things don't go quite according to plan, they can then bring themselves back. And you often see that, in not just fighting, but also in other sports. There might be the best athlete might be losing, and they can, the number of times they dig themselves out of it and they manage to come back, and it's because they have those fallback plans, those what-if scenarios. They don't panic, so they don't think like, oh no, it's all going wrong and I'm feeling really stressed, and then it gets worse and worse and worse. It's no problem to them. It's like, right, okay, this has happened, so I need to do this. And then they come back stronger, and then they usually win. A lot of the time people might watch sport and think, what are the chances of that? But actually, that has quite a lot of, it's more likely they're going to come back than they're not going to come back, because they are the better athlete maybe, or the more experienced athlete, and they know how to implement these strategies to help them cope with stress.
No, you see that all the time. I completely agree on that. And if we were to, obviously, if you were speaking to a coach who coached a lot of athletes, and maybe they wanted to write something on the wall, or maybe they wanted a system, how would you summarize and bullet points the things that they should be focusing on with their athletes to help them, with the things that we've spoken about today?
I'd probably say, first of all, stress is good. Embrace it. That's probably a key one. or help the athlete embrace it. Preparation is key. So help the athlete prepare, develop the strategies, devise what-if scenarios, and encourage use of imagery to feel more confident and prepared. So they'd probably be the key things that I would suggest for a coach. They're the bullet points that they want to do. Maybe even they're the bullet points to even write for the athlete to look at, to remind themselves what they need to be doing as well.
So for anyone listening or watching this podcast, is there any way they can, like books or studies, or can they speak to you? Is there anything they can do to learn more about these subject matters? Obviously, we've spoken a lot, but we can't cover everything in one podcast. So if people have gone there, this is so interesting, is there any resources or any follow-up to this that you might recommend?
There's quite a few blogs and things online. Actually, I'm due to write a blog at some point quite soon about sort of looking at stress more positively. But in terms of techniques like imagery and things, there's lots of blogs or online. If you kind of just Google, athletes imagery, quite a few things come up there to sort of show you the different things that you can visualize. And then I guess it's just a case of, based on what we've talked about today, taking those ideas and applying them to fighting based on what we've talked about. And so I'd probably recommend doing that. A lot of what I've said is then addressed in some of these different things, perhaps in more detail. So maybe it's a case of taking these principles and then trying to find more details online about them and how they can then implement them in their training and their competition.
Okay, well, I've learned so much from this podcast. I've really enjoyed speaking to you, Sarah. It's been amazing. I'm so grateful for you having spared the time. I've really enjoyed it, and it's been really informative. And some of the points you've made in this discussion has already changed some of the ways that I'm now going to speak and deal with some of the athletes that I deal with on a regular basis. It's funny, isn't it? Even though you've been involved in sports a long time, sometimes just different languages and different perspectives can go, okay, maybe that's a better way of doing something. But I really do appreciate the time that you spent today. Thank you very much. It's been amazing to speak to you.
Yeah, no, you're very welcome. It's been great.